The scariest thing about Insidious, out of the further, isn't what's hiding inside the further. It's what happens when the further learns how to come outside. For 15 years, the Insidious franchise has built its nightmares around a simple boundary. The living exist here. The dead, the lost, and the things that prey upon them exist somewhere beyond. That place is the further, a purgatorial realm that turned astral projection into one of modern horror's most recognizable ideas. But this time, the boundary itself becomes the monster. Gemma isn't merely someone who can travel into the further. She discovers that she can bring what lives there back with her. And suddenly, the old rules of the franchise become much more frightening because they no longer point in only one direction. The danger isn't just that the living might enter the world of the dead. The dead may finally have found a way to enter ours. That distinction changes everything. In the earlier films, astral projection was frightening because leaving the body created vulnerability. A person could wander somewhere they did not understand and encounter entities that had no reason to respect the boundaries of human life. Possession made that fear intimate. A haunted house made it domestic. The further made it cosmic. But out of the further takes all three ideas and turns them inside out. If Gemma can cross the threshold and return with something attached to her, then the supernatural no longer needs to wait inside a haunted room. It can travel. It can hide inside ordinary life. It can cross into bedrooms, hallways, family conversations, and the spaces where a mother believes she is protecting her child. That makes Gemma's power one of the film's most fascinating ideas and one of its most dangerous dramatic devices. On the surface, the ability looks like an advantage. Knowledge of the further should make a person better equipped to fight what lives there. But horror has always understood that knowledge can be its own form of exposure. The more Gemma understands, the more the supernatural world understands about her. And once the entities recognize what she can do, her gift becomes a doorway they have every reason to keep open. At the center of that doorway is a mother and daughter. Gemma is not exploring another dimension because she wants power, fame, or forbidden knowledge. Her choices are shaped by Maya. That matters because parental fear is different from ordinary fear. When danger threatens you, survival is instinctive. When danger threatens your child, survival becomes responsibility. You are no longer deciding only whether you are willing to suffer. You are deciding how much suffering you are willing to risk on behalf of someone who depends on you. That makes every supernatural choice Gemma makes emotionally complicated. Even when she is wrong, the audience can understand why she keeps moving forward. And then there is the house. Gemma lives in the house where she grew up, which means the physical location already contains a history before the ghosts arrive. The house isn't simply a container for supernatural events. It is a memory palace. Every room can exist simultaneously in two versions: the ordinary room Gemma sees now and the emotional room she remembers from childhood. This is one of the film's strongest foundations because the further is not the only place where the past refuses to disappear. Gemma has already been living inside another kind of further. That is why the supernatural premise can be read psychologically without reducing the ghosts to imaginary projections. The entities are real within the film's world, but their presence still carries metaphorical weight. Trauma does not always stay where it happened. Grief does not disappear because someone changes their address. Memories can invade ordinary moments without permission. Sometimes the past follows people because they have never truly finished living with it. Out of the Further gives that emotional truth a physical shape. It asks what would happen if the things we carry inside ourselves could eventually find a way to walk outside us. The return of Elise Rainier makes that question even more significant. Lin Shaye's Elise is one of the franchise's defining figures, and her presence immediately reconnects this new story to the emotional history of Insidious. She represents experience in a mythology that constantly threatens to overwhelm newcomers. Gemma is learning what the Further is. Elise already knows what it can take from people. That contrast allows the film to place two generations of supernatural understanding beside each other. Gemma's relationship with the Further is instinctive. Elise's is earned through years of encounters, losses, and survival. But Elise's return also raises a question that hangs over every long-running franchise. When does continuity become comfort, and when does comfort become dependence? That question is impossible to ignore because Out of the Further is the sixth Insidious film. The franchise began with James Wan and Lee Hwanell's original 2010 story, expanded through Chapter 2, moved backward through Chapter 3 and The Last Key, and then returned to the Lambert family in The Red Door. Sony now describes the series as having earned more than $740 million globally before this installment, a reminder that Insidious is not merely a collection of horror movies. It is an established commercial property with a recognizable mythology, recognizable imagery, and recognizable faces. That history creates both freedom and pressure. The filmmakers can introduce a new family because audiences already understand the mythology. But they also have to answer the question of necessity. Why another Insidious movie? Why this family? Why now? Why should audiences care about another trip into the Further when they have already seen several versions of it? The answer, at least in concept, is Gemma. Rather than simply repeat the Lambert story, Out of the Further changes the relationship between the protagonist and the supernatural world. Gemma isn't only being hunted by the Further. She has access to it. The film's official premise makes that reversal explicit. She can enter the realm of lost souls, but she can also bring what lives there into the real world. That is the hook the entire movie has to justify. Everything else, Elise, the demons, the house, the mythology, the family drama, exists around that central mechanism. And that is why this analysis has to go beyond a plot recap. The interesting question isn't simply whether Gemma survives. It's whether the film successfully transforms the Further from a familiar franchise setting into something newly frightening. It means examining Gemma as a character, Maya as the emotional center of her choices, Elise as both mentor and franchise bridge, and the supernatural antagonists as more than creatures designed to appear in dark hallways. It means looking at how the film uses architecture, framing, sound, silence, music, performance, and pacing to create fear. It means asking whether the mythology becomes richer as it becomes larger, or whether explaining the Further too much gradually removes the mystery that made it terrifying. And it means separating nostalgia from craft. Because audiences can love an Insidious movie for reasons that have nothing to do with whether every scene works. They can hear the familiar sound and immediately remember the first time the franchise frightened them. They can see Elise and feel the comfort of recognition. They can enter the Further and experience a strange kind of cinematic nostalgia for a place that was never real. That emotional history matters. But it can also make criticism difficult. A familiar franchise can receive affection simply for returning. Out of the Further arrives in theaters with exactly that tension. It is new enough to introduce a different family and a different supernatural mechanism, but familiar enough to trigger expectations before the first scare occurs. The trailers and marketing emphasize the central reversal. The Further is no longer simply somewhere characters go. It is becoming something that can come for the living world. Sony positions Gemma's unusual ability as the mechanism that allows this transformation, while Elisa's presence reassures longtime viewers that the new story remains connected to the established mythology. That combination creates an unusual audience experience. New viewers can approach the film as a supernatural thriller about a mother and daughter. Returning fans arrive carrying 15 years of knowledge. They know what astral projection means. They know why the Further is dangerous. They know Elise. They know the visual grammar of the franchise. They know that a quiet hallway is rarely just a hallway. And perhaps most importantly, they know that sound. The Insidious franchise has always understood that horror can be heard before it is seen. A musical sting can make an empty room feel occupied. A whisper can turn a doorway into a threat. Silence can become more uncomfortable than noise because silence asks the audience to listen for something that hasn't happened yet. That sonic identity is part of why the franchise remains recognizable even when the individual stories change. The sixth film therefore enters a difficult creative territory. It needs to surprise people who already know its tricks. It needs to make a familiar mythology feel dangerous again. It needs to use Elise without allowing her to overshadow Gemma. And above all, it needs to make the audience believe that the Further still contains something they haven't already seen. The film's own answer is simple: change the direction of the threat. The Further was once the place people feared entering. Now the terrifying possibility is that it may no longer need them to enter at all. That idea becomes even more interesting when placed beside the franchise's production history. James Wan and Lee Hwanel established the original supernatural language, but Out of the Further places writer-director Jacob Chase at the center of the new chapter. Sony credits Chase with the screenplay and credits Chase and David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick with the story, while Jason Blum, Oren Peli, James Wan, and Lee Hwanel remain producers. Chase arrives with experience in supernatural horror through Come Play, but directing a sixth Insidious film presents a different challenge from creating an original nightmare. An original horror movie can establish its own rules. A franchise installment inherits them. That inheritance is both useful and restrictive. The original Insidious succeeded partly because the Further felt like an idea that had not been over-explained. It was strange enough to become memorable and structured enough to support a story. Characters could enter it, but audiences never felt that they completely understood it. That uncertainty created space for imagination. The Further was a realm, but it was also a mystery. As the franchise expanded, however, every new chapter naturally added information. New entities appeared. New histories emerged. Elisa's past became part of the mythology. The Lambert family's connection to the Further deepened. Eventually the audience knew enough to begin recognizing patterns. Out of the Further faces the logical consequence of that expansion. How do you make a sixth film feel like a new nightmare instead of another haunted house episode? The solution is to make the protagonist's ability itself part of the mythology. Gemma's power creates storytelling possibilities because it gives her a reason to enter the Further voluntarily. But it also creates a serious risk. If the protagonist can move through the supernatural world too easily, the further may stop feeling dangerous. Horror depends on vulnerability. The audience must believe that entering the darkness can cost something. So Gemma's ability has to operate as both weapon and liability. She needs it to confront the threat, but using it gives the threat more opportunities to reach her. That is a strong horror contradiction because it turns every supernatural action into a moral decision. Should Gemma enter? Should she stay? Should she bring something back if it could help Maya? Should she trust what she sees? Should she listen to Elise? And if she opens the door, can she guarantee that she will be the only thing coming through it? Those questions are more important than any individual scare because they establish the movie's dramatic engine. A jump scare can frighten the audience for a few seconds. A dangerous choice can create tension for an entire act. The production itself also places the film firmly within theatrical horror. The movie opened widely on August 21, 2026, with a 1-hour, 46-minute runtime and Dolby Atmos sound, presented in a 2.39:1 digital aspect ratio. Those technical choices matter because Out of the Further is built around space and sound. The wider frame gives filmmakers room to isolate characters inside domestic environments. A person can occupy one side of the image while an empty corridor stretches across the other. Nothing may happen in that corridor, but the audience has already learned to distrust empty space. The sound system can then extend that distrust beyond the frame. A horror film about boundaries benefits from a theater because the screen itself becomes a boundary. The audience sits on one side. The supernatural world exists on the other. When a sound appears to come from behind the viewer, that boundary becomes psychologically unstable. When a figure emerges from darkness at the edge of the frame, the audience experiences a smaller version of Gemma's problem. Something has crossed into a space that was supposed to remain separate. The marketing understood this conceptual advantage. The film's hook was not merely another demon or another haunted house. It was the idea that the further could come into our world. That is immediately understandable, even to someone unfamiliar with every chapter of the franchise. It also creates an almost apocalyptic implication without requiring an enormous scale. If one mother can bring something back, the threat is potentially larger than one house. The supernatural has found a route. That is why the film's pre-release landscape was filled with both curiosity and skepticism. The sixth installment arrives after The Red Door, a movie that returned to the Lambert family and was marketed as the final chapter of that family's saga. Sony described The Red Door as the concluding chapter of the Lambert family story, with Josh and Dalton confronting their past through the further. Out of the Further responds by changing families and changing the rules. In theory, that makes the new film feel less like another continuation and more like a soft reset. But soft resets are difficult. The audience wants novelty without losing the identity it came for. Gemma provides the novelty. Elise provides the identity. The Further provides the mythology. And the question is whether those three elements can coexist without one overwhelming the others. That question follows Gemma into the house where her story begins. As a child, she knew the building as home. As an adult, she returns to it while raising Maya. The physical return therefore creates a loop between generations. Gemma is now the mother, but she is also the child who once lived there. The same walls that once surrounded her childhood now surround her daughter. That repetition creates an unsettling possibility. What if the past isn't merely remembered? What if it is inherited? The film's emotional architecture grows out of that question. Gemma wants Maya to be safe, but the house carries experiences Gemma herself has not completely escaped. The supernatural disturbance therefore doesn't arrive in an emotionally neutral environment. It enters a place already charged with unresolved history. At first, the ordinary world remains intact. Mother and daughter have routines. Rooms have purposes. The house is simply a house. But horror works by corrupting that familiarity one detail at a time. A strange sound can be dismissed. A shadow can be explained. A disturbing sensation can be blamed on exhaustion. The audience, however, has already been given enough information to suspect that these explanations are temporary. The longer Gemma remains inside the house, the more the ordinary begins to feel unstable. This slow erosion of certainty is essential because the supernatural becomes more frightening when it is allowed to emerge from normal life instead of replacing it immediately. If everything is strange from the first minute, nothing is strange. The contrast creates the fear. A kitchen is harmless until something moves when nobody is there. A bedroom is comforting until a child hears a voice that doesn't belong to anyone in the house. A hallway is mundane until it becomes too long, too dark, or too quiet. Gemma's childhood history makes those spaces even more complicated. The house becomes a physical manifestation of memory. It is not simply where the horror happens. It is part of why the horror matters. The first signs that Gemma can enter the further therefore carry two forms of discovery. She is learning something about the supernatural world, but she is also learning something about herself. Her ability suggests that the boundary between her consciousness and the further has always been thinner than she realized. That is frightening because it means the supernatural isn't necessarily an outside force that selected her at random. It may be connected to something already inside her history. Once she begins crossing over, the visual language changes. The further has its familiar qualities: fog, darkness, distorted spaces, the sensation of being somewhere recognizable but fundamentally wrong. The world feels emptied of ordinary human comfort. There is architecture without safety, rooms without belonging, corridors without destinations. The environment resembles reality just enough to make the difference disturbing. Gemma's first encounters with the entities reinforce the same idea. They aren't frightening only because they look unnatural. They are frightening because they appear to understand that she is alive. The further is populated by things that can observe, pursue, manipulate, and wait. Gemma is not walking through an abandoned landscape. She is entering a territory occupied by beings with their own interests. That changes the meaning of astral projection. Earlier Insidious stories often treated projection as a dangerous form of travel. Here, travel becomes communication. Gemma's presence inside the further creates a relationship between her and the entities. And relationships, unlike simple locations, can develop. The supernatural threat gradually becomes more active around the family. Strange events intensify. Gemma tries to rationalize them because denial is not stupidity, it is self-protection. Accepting the supernatural means accepting that her daughter may be in danger from something no ordinary parenting strategy can control. A locked door cannot stop a spirit. A security system cannot detect something that doesn't obey physical rules. A move to another neighborhood might not matter if the problem is connected to Gemma herself. This is where Maya's role becomes increasingly important. Their relationship is not merely there to give Gemma something to protect. Maya is also the emotional test of Gemma's judgment. A mother who is frightened can become overprotective. A mother who feels guilty can become reckless. A mother who believes her child is in supernatural danger may begin making decisions based on information nobody else can verify. Gemma's fear therefore creates both strength and weakness. She will go farther than anyone else because Maya needs her. But she may also go farther than anyone else because she cannot accept the possibility that there are things she cannot fix. That distinction becomes critical when Elise enters the story's supernatural equation. Elise Rainier understands that the further cannot be treated like an ordinary problem. Her experience gives her a vocabulary for what Gemma is seeing. She knows that entities can deceive. She knows that fear can distort judgment. She knows that entering the further is not simply a matter of courage. There are consequences to crossing boundaries that cannot always be predicted. The contrast between Gemma and Elise is one of the film's more useful character dynamics. Gemma has instinct. Elise has knowledge. Gemma is driven by motherhood. Elise is driven by experience and responsibility toward people facing forces they cannot understand. Together they represent two generations of insidious storytelling. Yet Elise's presence also creates the danger of overfamiliarity. Because audiences already know her, her arrival can immediately reduce uncertainty. The viewer trusts her. The movie can use her as a shortcut for exposition. But the more Elise explains, the less the audience has to discover with Gemma. This is one of the franchise's recurring tensions. Mythology helps the audience understand the world, but too much understanding can weaken mystery. The entities, meanwhile, are learning what Gemma can do. That is the turning point. They are not simply stalking her because she has entered their territory. They are interested because she has access. She can cross the boundary. More importantly, she may be able to transport something from one side to the other. The horror is no longer one-directional. Gemma crosses into the further. The further can cross back. And suddenly the house becomes more than a haunted location. It becomes a potential gateway. This is where the film's central premise begins to operate as a story rather than a marketing line. The danger of bringing something back is not abstract. Every object, every entity, every piece of knowledge acquired in the further can potentially alter the physical world. The boundary between worlds becomes porous. That makes the idea of contamination more powerful than a simple attack. A monster that appears in a room is frightening. A monster that can hide inside the relationship between a mother and daughter is harder to defeat because it doesn't need to remain visible. It can influence decisions. It can manipulate guilt. It can exploit grief. And Gemma is particularly vulnerable to that because she wants to help. The desire to help is one of horror's most dangerous instincts. People open doors because someone is crying on the other side. They follow voices because they sound familiar. They return to places because they believe answers are waiting there. They refuse to let go because letting go feels like abandoning someone they love. That emotional logic is what allows supernatural horror to become more than a collection of scares. The monster doesn't need to force the protagonist into danger if the protagonist will enter danger voluntarily for an understandable reason. Gemma crosses the threshold because Maya matters more to her than her own safety. And once she crosses, the story cannot return to the old rules. The further has become active. The entities have discovered a route. The house is no longer completely separate from the realm beyond it. And Gemma has to decide whether the ability that makes her uniquely capable of confronting the darkness is also the ability that has invited the darkness inside. The middle of the story grows from that contradiction. Gemma's journeys into the further become more frequent, but repetition does not necessarily mean the journeys are identical. Each visit changes the emotional meaning of the realm. At first, the further is a place she fears. Then it becomes a place she needs to understand. Eventually, it becomes a place she must confront deliberately. That evolution parallels Gemma's character development. Fear initially makes her want to escape. Responsibility forces her to investigate. Guilt makes her question whether her investigation has made things worse. Eventually, agency requires her to stop treating the further as something that simply happens to her. This is one of the strongest possibilities in the film's structure because it transforms supernatural exploration into character progression. Gemma doesn't become stronger because she stops being afraid. She becomes stronger because fear no longer determines every decision. But the further itself becomes more dangerous as she learns more about it. The realm is not empty. It is populated. And that population includes different kinds of entities, each suggesting a different relationship between the dead and the living. Some appear as predators. Others may seem trapped. Some carry recognizable human qualities while others appear almost completely consumed by whatever exists beyond death. The variety reinforces the idea that the further isn't simply hell. It is a landscape of unresolved existence. That distinction matters because the film's mythology begins moving toward questions about why souls remain, what they want, and whether death can actually be undone. Cyrus Lamb becomes important within that mythology. His presence introduces a human dimension to the supernatural threat because the danger is no longer represented only by anonymous entities. There is history behind it. Ambition, obsession, belief, and the desire to manipulate death begin to shape the conflict. And that creates a thematic mirror between Cyrus and Gemma. Gemma wants to protect someone she loves. The supernatural forces exploit that instinct. She wants to preserve life. They want access to life. She sees the boundary between worlds as something she might use to save someone. They see it as a door that should remain open. The same doorway can therefore represent two completely different intentions. That is the heart of supernatural horror. The object itself is not always evil. The desire attached to it can be. A door is only a door until someone wants something badly enough to open it. The further is only a realm until someone believes the dead should not remain there. And Gemma's tragedy is that her maternal instinct constantly pushes her toward the very boundary she has reason to fear. As the supernatural disturbances grow, the family home becomes increasingly unsafe. This is where the movie's domestic setting becomes most effective. The horror does not need to leave the house because the house is already connected to Gemma's emotional history. The audience sees ordinary spaces become threatening through repetition. A familiar doorway becomes a place where something might appear. A room associated with childhood becomes a reminder that Gemma's past is not finished with her. The house also becomes a symbol of inherited trauma. Gemma grew up there. Maya is now growing up there. That repetition creates a generational pattern. If Gemma cannot confront what happened to her, Maya may inherit the emotional consequences even without experiencing the original event herself. This is why motherhood and trauma are so closely connected in the story. Gemma is not only protecting Maya from monsters. She is trying to prevent the past from becoming Maya's future. The supernatural makes that struggle literal. The past enters the present. The dead refuse to remain dead. And what Gemma thought belonged to another generation begins appearing inside her daughter's life. The midpoint crisis emerges when the audience realizes that Gemma's ability is not merely a defense mechanism. It is the mechanism through which the threat can expand. What seemed like an extraordinary advantage becomes a liability. This is the kind of reversal that horror stories need because it changes the audience's interpretation of everything that came before. Earlier journeys into the further are no longer simply brave. They may have created opportunities for the entities. Earlier attempts to understand the supernatural may have given the supernatural more information about Gemma. Every act of investigation becomes potentially dangerous. The result is a devastating psychological question. Is Gemma actually protecting Maya, or is she unintentionally making Maya more vulnerable? That question can break a character more effectively than any monster. Because Gemma can fight a creature. She cannot easily fight guilt. She can close a door. She cannot erase the memory of opening it. She can protect Maya from an entity. She cannot guarantee that her own fear will never become the thing that harms Maya. This is where Elisa's role becomes particularly important. Experience gives her the ability to recognize patterns Gemma cannot see. But knowledge has limits. The further is not a machine with an instruction manual. It is a supernatural environment shaped by human emotion, memory, death, and desire. Understanding its rules does not guarantee control over it. That difference between knowledge and control becomes one of the film's most important ideas. People often assume that understanding something makes it manageable. Horror disagrees. Sometimes understanding the monster only tells you how much danger you're in. The more Gemma learns, the clearer the threat becomes. The possibility of permanent crossover transforms the further from an isolated supernatural realm into a potential invasion point. If the entities can reach the physical world through Gemma, then the problem is no longer confined to her family. The boundary itself is at risk. That escalation also explains why the house becomes such an important symbolic battlefield. It represents both Gemma's childhood and Maya's present. It is where the past and future overlap. If the supernatural breaks through there, it is not simply invading a building. It is invading the space where two generations are connected. Gemma's lowest point arrives when she has to question the very ability she once believed might help her. Should she stop entering the further? Should she abandon the only method she has of understanding the enemy? Or is refusing to use the ability simply another form of avoidance? The dilemma is cruel because both choices can be defended. Entering creates danger. Refusing to enter may leave Maya defenseless. This is where Gemma's character arc moves from survival toward agency. She cannot remain trapped between fear and denial. She has to accept that the past exists, that the further exists, that her ability exists, and that none of those facts can be erased simply because she wishes they were different. The house becomes the physical representation of that acceptance. For most of the story, Gemma wants the house to become normal. But the deeper truth is that normality cannot be restored by pretending nothing happened. The past must be confronted. The door must be understood. And eventually, the person who opened it must decide how to close it. That leads into the final confrontation, where Gemma's personal history, maternal instincts, and supernatural ability finally converge. The climax works best when it is understood not simply as a battle between a woman and a demon, but as the culmination of Gemma's struggle to stop allowing her past to control her present. She returns to the further deliberately. That distinction matters. Earlier, she entered because she was pulled by fear, curiosity, or necessity. Now she enters with purpose. The further is no longer an unknown place she accidentally stumbled into. It is the environment in which she must make her final choice. The realm becomes a battlefield because the boundaries between worlds have become unstable. Gemma must use the very power that caused the problem to solve it. This creates the final version of the film's central contradiction. The doorway cannot simply be destroyed from the outside. Someone who understands both sides must confront what is on the other side. Maya's presence gives the confrontation its emotional stakes. Gemma's choices have always been about protecting her daughter, but the climax forces Maya to become more than a passive victim. Their relationship has been shaped by fear, secrecy, and protection. The final conflict therefore becomes an opportunity to resolve not only the supernatural threat but the emotional distance that fear has created between them. Elisa's contribution reinforces the idea that Gemma no longer has to face the further alone. Elise has always represented guidance, but the most meaningful version of that guidance is not solving the problem for Gemma. It is helping her become capable of solving it herself. That is also why the central confrontation with Cyrus and the supernatural forces surrounding him carries thematic significance. Cyrus represents the dangerous human desire to control death rather than accept its boundary. His mythology pushes the film toward one of horror's oldest questions: what would humanity do if death became negotiable? The answer is rarely comforting. People might bring back someone they love. They might seek forbidden knowledge. They might refuse to accept loss. And once death becomes something people believe they can manipulate, the emotional consequences become limitless. Gemma stands on the opposite side of that desire. She wants to protect life, not conquer death. Her journey is ultimately about accepting responsibility for the living rather than becoming consumed by what has already been lost. The further therefore becomes a battlefield between two philosophies. One says the dead should be used, recovered, manipulated, or brought back. The other says love sometimes means accepting that someone is gone. That tension gives the climax more meaning than a simple supernatural victory. Gemma's transformation is not that she becomes fearless. She becomes willing to act despite fear. That is a more believable form of courage. When the boundary finally comes under control, the question is not simply whether the monsters are defeated. It is what remains unresolved. The Insidious mythology has always depended on the idea that supernatural boundaries can be crossed, so complete closure is difficult. A door can be closed without proving that the room behind it has ceased to exist. That ambiguity is valuable. A horror ending does not have to destroy the darkness. Sometimes it only needs to establish that the characters have survived one encounter with it. The final scenes therefore carry two meanings. On the story level, Gemma and Maya can move forward. On the thematic level, Gemma has finally stopped treating her past as something she can outrun. The house no longer has the same power because she has changed her relationship with it. And that is where the plot naturally becomes character analysis. Gemma works because her supernatural ability is inseparable from her identity as a mother. Her surface goal is simple: protect Maya. But beneath that is a more complicated emotional need. She wants to escape the influence of her past without allowing that past to determine the kind of mother she becomes. The house embodies that conflict. It is where she came from. It is where Maya is now. And between those two facts is the entire emotional structure of the film. Gemma's fear of repeating family patterns makes her supernatural power psychologically appropriate. Entering the further resembles entering buried memories. She has to go somewhere frightening because something unresolved exists there. But bringing entities back resembles the way unresolved trauma can follow a person home. You can leave a traumatic place and still carry its consequences into relationships, parenting, and identity. That metaphor becomes especially powerful because Gemma is a mother. Trauma is rarely experienced by only one generation. Parents can pass fears to children through behavior, silence, overprotection, anger, or avoidance. A child may inherit the emotional atmosphere of something they never personally experienced. Out of the further makes that invisible inheritance visible. Gemma's journey can therefore be understood as a movement from fear to agency. First comes fear. Then denial. Then discovery. Then guilt. Then acceptance. Finally, agency. The sequence matters because courage without acceptance can become recklessness. Gemma's early choices are often driven by urgency. Her later choices are driven by understanding. That is what separates survival from confrontation. Surviving trauma means finding a way to live around it. Confronting trauma means refusing to let it dictate every decision. The further becomes the perfect supernatural metaphor for that difference. You can spend your life avoiding the door. Or you can learn why you are afraid to open it. But there is another side to the film's psychology: the antagonists. The central supernatural threat is most interesting when it has a motivation beyond simply killing people. Cyrus and the entities associated with him connect the supernatural conflict to human desire. They represent what happens when the desire to overcome death becomes more important than accepting its limits. That makes the villains distorted reflections of Gemma. Gemma also wants to protect someone she loves. She also wants to prevent loss. She also wants to cross a boundary that should perhaps remain closed. The difference is intention. Gemma crosses because she fears losing the living. The antagonists exploit that fear because they want access to the living. This is why the concept of resurrection becomes so important. Bringing something back sounds like an act of love until the audience asks what exactly is being brought back. Is it the person who was lost? Is it only a memory? Is it a soul altered by death? Or is it something else wearing the shape of what people miss? Horror thrives on that uncertainty. The most frightening resurrection stories are not about whether the dead return. They are about whether what returns is truly the person we wanted. That is why explaining the supernatural antagonists too much can become a problem. Mystery gives monsters power. Motivation can make them more understandable, but understanding can reduce fear. A completely anonymous demon can be terrifying because the audience has no idea what it wants. An intelligent antagonist can be more compelling because it has goals, but once those goals are fully explained, the creature becomes a character rather than an unknown. Out of the Further constantly balances between those two modes. It wants mythology. It also wants mystery. It wants audiences to understand the rules. It also wants them to fear what exists beyond those rules. When the balance works, the Further feels larger. When it fails, the film risks turning supernatural horror into exposition. That is one reason the supporting cast becomes important. Supporting characters in a franchise horror movie have several jobs. They can provide emotional grounding, explain mythology, relieve tension, challenge the protagonist, or become victims whose fate demonstrates the danger. But when there are too many functions, characters can begin to feel like mechanisms rather than people. Elise remains the exception because she has emotional history with the audience. Lin Shaye's performance carries a kind of authority that cannot be manufactured by exposition. Elise can walk into a scene and immediately change its emotional temperature because viewers know what she represents. She has survived the mythology. She understands its costs. She also brings warmth into a franchise that can otherwise become relentlessly grim. That warmth matters. Horror needs contrast. If every character is terrified every second, fear becomes flat. A little humor, affection, or ordinary conversation can make the next supernatural interruption more disturbing. Elise has always been capable of carrying both compassion and eccentricity, and Lin Shaye's presence allows the film to preserve some of the franchise's personality. The new supporting characters, including the roles played by Brandon Perea and Maisie Richardson Sellers, have a more difficult task. They have to serve a story that already contains a large mythology while still feeling like individuals. Sam Spruell's Cyrus occupies the opposite end of that spectrum, carrying the weight of the supernatural history and becoming part of the film's explanation of what the entities want. Maya remains the emotional center because her relationship with Gemma gives the supernatural conflict its human consequences. Without that relationship, Gemma's ability would remain an interesting mechanic. With it, the ability becomes dangerous because every mistake has a face. That is the difference between plot stakes and emotional stakes. The plot says the Further might invade the real world. The emotion says Maya might be the person standing closest to the door when it happens. And that brings the film to its central themes. Motherhood is the most obvious one, but the movie uses motherhood in a more interesting way than simply making Gemma protective. Motherhood becomes a confrontation with inheritance. Gemma is raising a child while still carrying unresolved pieces of her own childhood. She wants to protect Maya from the things that hurt her, but she cannot protect Maya by pretending those things never existed. That creates the film's deeper question. Can you truly escape the past if part of you is still living inside it? The Further answers that question literally. No. Not until you confront it. The film also explores grief and the inability to let go. Death creates a boundary humans understand intellectually but resist emotionally. We know people die. We know the dead cannot return. Yet cultures across history have created rituals, religions, stories, and myths around communicating with the dead. We imagine afterlives because the finality of death is emotionally difficult to accept. Supernatural horror takes that difficulty and turns it into a threat. The dead return. But the return is dangerous. The message is not simply that death is scary. It is that refusing to accept death can be dangerous. The further represents the space where that refusal becomes physical. The same applies to trauma. A traumatic memory can feel like something that exists in the present even though it happened in the past. The body can react before the mind has time to explain why. A familiar room can trigger an old fear. A sound can bring back a feeling that was buried for years. In that sense, trauma behaves like a ghost. It appears without permission. It changes how ordinary spaces feel. It makes the past present. And it can be passed from one generation to another. That makes the house one of the film's most important symbols. It is architecture transformed into memory. Doors represent choices and boundaries. Hallways represent movement through a past that seems to stretch farther than expected. Windows represent the possibility of seeing something outside while remaining physically inside. Mirrors suggest identity and memory, especially when a character is forced to confront a version of themselves they would rather avoid. Shadows function similarly. A shadow is proof of something without revealing exactly what that thing is. It is presence without full knowledge. That makes it ideal for supernatural horror. The further's fog and obscured visibility operate on the same principle. What the audience cannot see becomes part of what the audience fears. Darkness doesn't have to contain a monster. It only has to make the audience believe there might be one. This is why wide framing can be so effective. A close-up shows the face and controls the viewer's attention. A wide shot can do the opposite. It allows the audience to scan the image and search for danger. Negative space becomes active. The empty portion of the frame becomes a question. Is something there? Did it move? Was that shape present a moment ago? The viewer begins participating in the horror. The architecture of the house also mirrors the structure of memory. Memories are not always linear. One room can lead to another emotional period. One object can trigger an entirely different moment. The further works similarly. Its spaces are connected by psychological associations as much as physical geography. That is why thresholds are so important. A threshold is neither one space nor the other. It is the moment of crossing. Gemma exists in that state throughout the film. Mother and daughter. Past and present. Living world and further. Fear and agency. Victim and participant. Every important relationship in the story involves a boundary. The deeper meaning becomes even more interesting when the further is treated as more than a supernatural location. It can be understood as a metaphor for everything human beings cannot completely leave behind. Dead people remain alive in memory. Trauma remains alive in behavior. Grief remains alive in relationships. Childhood remains alive in adult identity. The supernatural world simply gives these invisible forces bodies. That is why the question of resurrection is philosophically powerful. Should the dead remain dead? From a practical perspective, the answer seems obvious. From an emotional perspective, it is much harder. If you could hear the voice of someone you lost, would you answer? If you could see them again, would you open the door? If you knew there was a price, would love make you pay it anyway? Those are the questions horror asks because they are more frightening than any demon. A monster can be defeated. Grief cannot. The desire to communicate with the dead is universal enough to cross cultures and generations. People leave messages at graves, preserve photographs, replay recordings, revisit places, keep possessions, and tell stories. We know the person is gone, but we continue creating ways for them to remain present. Insidious turns that psychological impulse into literal supernatural communication. The danger is that the thing answering may not be what we hoped for. That is the ethical tension beneath the mythology. The further promises access to what has been lost, but access is not the same as restoration. Bringing something back does not guarantee that you have brought back what you loved. This is where maternal love becomes both strength and vulnerability. Gemma's love for Maya gives her the courage to confront supernatural forces, but that same love can be manipulated. The more a character has to lose, the more predictable their choices become. A monster doesn't have to control Gemma's mind if it can threaten the person she loves. That is why family is both sanctuary and vulnerability. The family home is where Gemma expects protection. It is also where the supernatural can hurt her most. The film's broader emotional relevance comes from that contradiction. Modern audiences live with a similar anxiety in less supernatural forms. Home can feel unsafe. Technology can bring unwanted memories into private spaces. Childhood trauma can follow adults into relationships. The past can reappear through photographs, messages, locations, or family patterns. The further is simply the most dramatic version of that fear. It is the place where everything we cannot leave behind waits. The film's visual language reinforces this metaphor. The contrast between ordinary reality and the further is not only a matter of color and lighting. It is a difference in psychological rules. Normal reality has routines. The further has uncertainty. Normal reality has physical boundaries. The further treats those boundaries as suggestions. Doors become symbolic because they represent the illusion of control. We close doors to keep things out. We open doors to let things in. But in horror, the door often reveals that control was never absolute. The house's hallways can feel threatening because they create a progression without guaranteeing safety. Mirrors can suggest that identity is unstable. Windows create the possibility of being watched. Shadows imply presence. Fog conceals information. Wide shots isolate characters. Close-ups trap them inside their own reactions. These are not merely visual decorations. They are emotional tools. A filmmaker can make a room frightening without putting anything inside it by changing the way the audience understands the room. That is one of the oldest principles of cinematic horror. The room remains the same. The meaning changes. And that is exactly what happens to Gemma's house. It begins as home. It becomes memory. Then it becomes a threat. Finally, it becomes the place where Gemma confronts the meaning of both. The deeper philosophical question is whether human beings can control what cannot be controlled. Death is the ultimate example. We build technology, medicine, rituals, stories, and beliefs around mortality, but eventually the boundary remains. The supernatural antagonist represents the temptation to break it. Gemma represents the temptation to cross it for love. And the further represents the consequence of believing that every boundary exists to be overcome. This is where the film's ambitions become both impressive and vulnerable. The themes are rich. But themes alone do not guarantee a great horror movie. The execution has to turn ideas into emotion rather than simply explaining them. That issue becomes especially important when examining the visual effects. Out of the Further is primarily live-action horror, so its supernatural imagery depends on a mixture of physical performance, makeup, creature work, environmental design, compositing, atmospheric effects, and digital manipulation. The goal of visual effects in horror is not simply to make impossible things look real. It is to make the audience emotionally believe in them. A perfect digital creature can still be frightening. A technically imperfect creature can sometimes be even more frightening if it feels physical. Practical effects have weight. Makeup has texture. A physical creature interacts with light differently from a digital one. Those qualities can make supernatural beings feel like objects that could actually occupy the room with the audience. That matters in a film built around crossing boundaries. The audience needs to believe that the entities can become physically present. If they look too artificial, the central premise loses some of its immediacy. The Further itself presents a similar challenge. Its visual design has to communicate that this is another realm without making it feel like an unrelated fantasy world. The strongest Insidious imagery has always played with that contradiction. The Further resembles reality enough to be recognizable, but the fog, lighting, shadows, and distorted spaces make it feel fundamentally wrong. That familiarity is important. If The Further looked completely alien, the audience would understand immediately that it was somewhere else. If it looks like a corrupted version of familiar spaces, the audience experiences something more unsettling. It feels close. It feels reachable. And that makes the idea of crossing into it believable. The film's visual effects therefore work best when they preserve mystery. Showing less can make the supernatural more frightening than showing everything. Once a creature is fully revealed, the audience can study it. Before that moment, imagination fills the gaps. This principle is especially important in a franchise where audiences already know many of the visual signatures. The more often The Further appears, the more difficult it becomes to make it feel mysterious. Chase's challenge is therefore not simply to create impressive supernatural images but to create images that feel psychologically different. His directorial approach also has to be considered in relation to James Wan. Wan's original Insidious relied heavily on controlled framing, sudden changes in visual information, and the manipulation of domestic spaces. Chase inherits that grammar but brings his own sensibility. His previous supernatural work gives him an understanding of how to create tension around unseen threats, but directing a franchise with established visual expectations requires restraint. The question isn't whether Chase can make a scary image. It's whether he can make an image that belongs to this film rather than simply to horror in general. Silence becomes especially important here. A scare is more effective when the audience has time to anticipate it. The silence before the event is part of the event. A camera that moves slowly through a room can create more anxiety than a rapid sequence of cuts because the audience has time to imagine what might happen. Long takes can make viewers feel trapped. Sudden cuts can create shock. Still frames can force the audience to search. Camera movement can suggest that something unseen is controlling the viewer's perspective. These choices become meaningful when they serve Gemma's psychology. If the camera isolates her inside a wide domestic frame, she appears small against her own home. If a close-up traps her face during a supernatural encounter, the audience experiences the fear through her reaction. If the camera holds on an empty doorway, the audience becomes a participant in the suspense. The best horror direction doesn't tell the audience what to fear. It teaches the audience where to look. And then it makes them regret looking. Where Chase's approach can succeed is in the concept of character-driven supernatural horror. Where it can feel conventional is when the franchise's established rhythm becomes too visible. The audience knows there will be a scare. They know the music may change. They know something may appear behind a character. The director's job becomes a game of timing. Can the film make us expect the wrong thing? Can it delay the scare? Can it let a moment play without delivering the obvious payoff? Can it use the audience's knowledge against them? That is where a sixth installment has to work hardest. The same challenge exists in the music. Joseph Bishara's relationship with the Insidious sound is part of the franchise's identity. The music doesn't simply accompany the supernatural. It prepares the nervous system for it. Dissonance, strings, electronic textures, abrupt tonal shifts, and low-frequency pressure can create anxiety before the image provides a reason. That is one of horror's most powerful tricks. The audience hears danger before seeing it. A musical cue can tell us something is wrong even when nothing in the frame has changed. Silence can do the opposite. When music disappears, the audience becomes hyper-aware of environmental sound. A breath becomes noticeable. A floorboard becomes significant. A distant voice becomes threatening. The absence of music creates a vacuum that the viewer's imagination fills. Franchise continuity through sound is especially powerful because music can trigger memory faster than dialogue. A familiar sonic texture can remind an audience of previous scares before the current scene has even developed. That can be a strength. It can also become predictable. If the audience learns exactly when the musical shock will arrive, the sound loses some of its ability to surprise. The relationship between score and editing therefore becomes crucial. A sudden cut paired with a sudden musical hit can produce an immediate jump. But suspense can be stronger when the music begins quietly and builds pressure without releasing it. The audience starts waiting for the scare. And waiting is often more frightening than seeing. The sound design extends this principle. Horror exists outside the frame. A voice can come from another room. A footstep can sound closer than it should. A door can move slightly. A breath can appear behind the character. Dolby Atmos gives filmmakers the ability to position sound around the audience, making the theater itself part of the supernatural environment. Rotten Tomatoes lists the film with Dolby Atmos and Dolby Digital sound mixes. Ordinary domestic noises can become terrifying because the audience understands them. A house creaks. Pipes move. Floors respond to weight. Doors close. Those sounds are normal until the timing becomes wrong. A footstep at night is not automatically supernatural. A footstep in a locked room is. The sound design works by changing the context of ordinary noise. That principle connects directly to the film's themes. The supernatural does not have to transform every part of reality.